career for a while. So I've touched on that before, as you know, in other shows. But as of lately, as you mentioned, we've been exploring the alternative models that are out there in regards to the people in of the Americas, and that's actually how I came across Lila, who is so gracious in coming on here today, who has one of those models available for us, which we hope to hear from her and her be able to expound on that a little bit later. So, Lila, thanks for being here.
Yeah, hi. This is Lila. It's all good. I'm just listening to all the introductions. No, that's all good. We're new. We're new here. This is my first time on, so thanks for having me. Sure. So my name's Lila Brown. I work as an entertainment publicist and sports agent out of Los Angeles, California. And I have roots in Kansas City, Missouri. And I went to high school and college in Atlanta, Georgia, and finished at Georgia State, mainly in journalism. So I really do have a knack for storytelling, presenting both sides, really having verified sources in terms of like if I'm delivering any news information. So I'm very keen on, very balanced stories and making sure I can give the perspectives and then kind of let people just determine for themselves and interpret, the information. And, we have a lot of background information that people can check out. So I'm always, sharing videos and images and stories. That's pretty much, I guess, how I came about in this group. And this is part of my introduction. So I'm liking it so far. So thanks for having me. Yeah, when the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, I mean, I was out there tomahawk chopping, just like in disbelief. My sister was like, "Oh no, we're going to that parade." I had moved my family at this point out to Los Angeles, and we thought, we were gonna get a LA Super Bowl when it was in Atlanta. So I went out there, party, had a good time. But when the Chiefs won it, I just really was just more solemn, just wanted to not brag before time. So I had no plans of going to the parade, but when they won and the parade was on that Wednesday, it brought the city together. Kansas City is a very special place, and so that's where I grew up. I love it, and I'm so happy for my team. They think so. That's what they said. They said we're going for number two, so we'll see if there's a season. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And tell the people, are you currently still in Mexico at the moment? Is
I
that where
am
you're?
in Mexico. Mexico is kind of like my safe haven when things get a little crazy and I just need to get back to nature. And so Mexico has a lot of private beaches. I'm near Tijuana, not too far from San Diego. And so you'll come to realize that California and Mexico, we call it Mexicali, this area. But it's still, I mean, it's like old before the Spanish American War. Those trading posts are still up. These places are very historic between that time when it was California and New Spain. So it's a very special place, and so I love the fact they still have a lot of culture that they like to put up, exhibit. I mean, you will have like ancient artifacts just like in the middle of a restaurant, and they'll tell you the story behind it. So it's really beautiful. So I'm always learning. I love coming out here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's awesome. That's awesome. And you're currently collecting artwork? Is that correct?
Well,
You
I'm
collect
just
it?
taking pictures right now because the artwork is embedded into like the walls of the restaurant or the hotel, or like the museums. But they are really, really keen on just showing people what it is. And it's not like, for some reason, these artifacts are not as highly valuable and prized as what you would see in the Met Museum or something. So they're just kind of there. Like OLMEC heads are just out. And so, because I've done a lot of research on like the OLMEC heads, I know how to tell if it's a fake or not. But you will get a lot of people, historians that are around, but a lot of people are just not interested in this stuff, or it's just very low visitor traffic. So you just kind of, when you see an authentic artifact, they'll try to give you as much history as possible about it and its authenticity. But other than that, you just kind of have to start spotting real from fake. Knowing the difference in the style and the artwork. So I had a great art appreciation class when I was in college. And so I just kind of like took my own independent route with that, not trying to make it a professional career, but I thought, in journalism, I can add that art appreciation to my storytelling. So
Right. Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
yeah, I'm familiar with Lakota. I actually have a former client of mine. I do public relations, like I was saying, and she was Lakota, so she taught me a lot about the tribe. And I love, even when I do my own Facebook Live or social media, I love talking about different types of tribes, whether they're my own or not. I still like to share stories, and so I love the story of like White Buffalo Calf Woman. I talk about Lakotas and Dakotas and all that good stuff, and I try to, whatever I'm learning, I try to share. And then, hopefully, like you said, more people will add and contribute their research and findings. And I think it'll make for a great collective story. Yeah. Yeah. Well, people are uncomfortable about racism in America altogether, and so really, it's just it was brutal. The stories are not always, fairy tales and rainbows, and so I think people, they don't want to feel guilty about anything that happened, but at the same time, if we can draw strength from what happened in stories, I think they can deal with, maybe they had a tie to the crime or the genocide, but it was real, and we want to honor those deaths. We want to remember these people, because that's also part of the spirituality, is keeping those memories going and keeping those stories going. And then always, the spiritual side is that we're not really dead. We pass on our offspring and our lineage, and that we're the descendants of those. So, it's an uncomfortable topic altogether, but at the same time, like, I'm happy to talk about it, and I think, it's a beautiful story, if you look at the other side of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I kind of want to start off with, well, first of all, Lila, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Are you part of any particular Native American tribe? I know.
Yeah, that's what I'm tracing right
Mhm.
now. Growing up, and the same thing for us in terms of why watching our story, we have to realize that there were also what I call melanated Aborigine people that were here as well. and especially if you look at South America and you look at its proximity, even Africa. So even if you want to use the story of those people going back and forth doing trade, but also just because of the Mayan and what I see in the artwork and the Aztec. So, and then the Olmec as well. So I think there's a lot of stories that are also pushed aside, in terms of like, if you say even American Indians and Native Americans were enslaved, and then they brought over these African slaves, all that's debatable as well. So I've been able to trace my lineage from the Dawes rolls, which a lot of people at the same time trying to discredit it. So it was like at the same time it was supposed to be something that was helpful, and it was tainted, and there was a lot of issues with it and a lot of forgeries. But at the same time, it's just like my ancestors were still a part of this Indian removal, being pushed back to Oklahoma, or even if the tribes that were already in Oklahoma had to then welcome in these forced tribes that were concentrating in this area, then that's still a whole story. So I've been able to trace my lineage all the way back to Wagner, Oklahoma, around this time, where my great grandmother and my great grandmother were on the Dawes rolls. And so they had it where if they were newborns, they had to register, and my people were detailed as Indian by blood. And so then that goes Muskogee, Creek, um, freedmen. But they also do this thing because of some people migrating from slavery to the tribes. It gets really murky because we're talking about eight, grandparents and great grandparents. It keeps going on. So we have things on the maternal side. I have some heritage on Native American on my grandfather's side, and so it's just a lot. Well, I'm repatriating now. I'm getting back involved now, and I just really started the paperwork because I started to see that my family members were getting approved. I have other family members that have used the benefits, and it's really discombobulated. It's like some people in our family have, and then it's like some people haven't. And so a lot of people said they don't want to bother. It's just too much. There's been people that have been removed, all these things. And so it really is intimidating. And it really is like, oh, are they going to give us pushback? So my sister and I decided, once we started to see some of our cousins around the same or a little bit older than us starting to get their either a Cherokee card, then we're getting ours now. We're working on it. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, it's just something where your family always tells you things, but then you're being taught something totally different in school. And so, like for us to say we're African American, but no one can tell me which tribe. And so when we do our DNA test, it'll say, oh, Afro Asiatic. But at the same time, it's like when you talk about tens of thousands of years ago, it could have been Asiatic people coming over from other parts of what we today call India. So you're talking about like 10, 20,000 years. I don't just limit my bloodline to like the past 600. I'm thinking hundreds of thousands of years ago. So, when you're thinking about that, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And you got to think about it. There were this group of people called the Moors who also were a part of Europe history. And so when they lost Granada in terms of war in 1492, it is believed some theories, or we know for a fact that the Moors also came to the Americas before Columbus did. Or before, but they always heard about this new world. It gets really murky because my family also has stories about Columbus, and you have to remember Columbus never stepped foot on the mainland. He was always in the Bahamas. So, we think about how you say he stepped foot in America, but no, the American islands is in the continent is two different things. And so we think about you have to really think microscopically, it's like someone saying molecular, and think about that. This is America's huge. And right now we have all these borders, but that wasn't the boundaries of the day. I mean, this was all connected. Even before the Panama Canal, it was all connected. So this is a lot of land to cover, and I think we should have a little bit more respect for even those small tribes that were maybe not thousands or millions, but maybe like a few hundred, and families and clans. So it becomes a part of this. My family was huge, but my grandfather and my grandmother always they met on the reservation, and so yeah. I believe it was the one in, oh my goodness, at this point, I want to say somewhere in Oklahoma, or but I also have a family in Wichita, Kansas. So I'm thinking like all those areas, but I know for a fact my grandmother was born in Wagner, that area, which is like northeast. You know, I haven't even really been to these places, but you, like I said, you hear these stories. Oh, we're this, and you know, but when you go to school and you're taught something else, you just kind of, it's like cognitive dissonance. Like you don't pay attention to what your parents are saying because you're being tested on these things at school, and so I think that's where a lot of the assimilation comes into it. We did African ancestry, and for that one, it put us. Yeah, yeah. It says Tuareg of Mali, which is one of the really mystic tribes, and the Tuareg, Taureg. Yeah, and if you look at the Tuareg, they vary from dark, like black skin to like light brown skin, and so then it's a lot of these other Middle Eastern coming in, Arabs. It's just so like it's like a lot of disenfranchising. So when I say Arab, I'm sometimes thinking my skin tone, but the average person thinking that you know what Syria looks like today. And you still got to remember, even North Africa has been colonized. And so when you look at me and say you're not, like they'll say that you're not Tuareg, but the DNA is saying we are, and it actually makes sense with a lot of French American, even French Canadian in the Americas. It kind of makes sense to me, you know, when they because the French today still kind of in a way controls parts of Mali. So, you know, you think about, well, my story is like, I can't tell my story without somebody interjecting colonialism. And so I'm like, I got to go back to the Precambrian area if I want to predate colonialism. I have to think, you know, almost to like Homo sapien, Homo erectus. Like I have to think further back than modern history before it was really tainted and confusing. And it's just everybody else is telling our story, but when can I tell my story? At this point, my family and what I feel like a lot of people in my community are saying is really zero. If you want to be honest, yeah, but that was like that's where they are today. When you take those tests, they say this is where your lineage is today. So we also recognize the fact that our ancestors also traveled to America. Like I'm engaged to a Liberian. His family left America after, some people left even after slavery. Some people left and then went to Africa because they've always told you, "Oh, you're African." You have to understand when even with the Slave Act, babies were being ripped out of the mother's hands, and then somebody told you you are from Africa. So we don't know. All we know is that there was kidnappings, babies were being taken from the mother's womb right to some other family to be sold into enslavement. And when that child grows up, they don't know who their mother and father is. So there's such a huge disconnect. So what we're starting to find out, though, if you look at a lot of like even the Seminoles, it looks they will say, "Oh, this is African." We know there's a lot of fabrication and manipulation and lies. So they've been telling us for a very long time, look at this style of clothing. That's African. Then we come to find out, no, that's Native American beadwork. That's American Aboriginal beadwork. And so we've been told a lot of things until we get to a point where we can do our own self exploration. I'm just finding contrasting stories and a lot of contradictions.
Right, right. And I think that's very important because, first of all, when it comes to the concept of identity alone, right? a lot of people have many different objections to when you try when they feel that you are trying to classify them or put them in a box. Um, and many of which I would say are not are all contextual. So, for example, there is in 2020 we have modern geopolitical borders. So we have modern nationalities in 2020. So there's absolutely no contradiction between somebody calling themselves an American, a U.S. American, if they're referring to their nationality in the USA, or calling themselves a Mexican if they are from the nation of Mexico or China or what have you, right? That's certainly one type of identity that you can have in 2020 due to the modern day geopolitical borders, right? There is another identity that you can have. If you want to identify yourself based on religious grounds and so on and so forth, you could call yourself a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, what have you. Um, then there are ethnic identities, which can vary. You can fit into multiple uh, boxes, I guess you could say, of ethnic identities, depending on who you ask and where you are in any given region, right? So, for example, in the U.S., the term Latino or Hispanic is very much well known, but it is a very broad umbrella. It covers a large landscape, beginning from Mexico all the way down to South America, right? And that is because overall, most Latinos, most Hispanics share a general cultural link that links them together that they can understand amongst each other, right? But back in their own countries, back home, that label, that macro umbrella may disappear. Back at home, they might have subcultures, sub ethnic groups
Yeah, I
within their own
agree.
countries, that they may recognize amongst each other, right? And um and then there are uh more objective, more scientific identities that you can take on if we are talking strictly genetics or strictly morphology, and so on and so forth, which don't necessarily have to go hand in hand with the modern national identities that you may have or ethnic identities that you may have, right? So, for example, when we talk about just using that example of the Latino or Hispanic umbrella, macro umbrella, you have many different races, some would say, or population groups, as modern geneticists would say, because modern geneticists and anthropologists don't really like to use the word quote unquote race. They like to use populations. So you have populations within the macro umbrella of Latinos that fit more closely with populations from West Africa, or that fit populations from Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, and those who we identify as Native Americans, Native Mexicans, who have been there for a very long time. This would be the Maya. This would be the descendants of the Nahuatl peoples, which used to cover the Mexica nation, better known as the Aztecs. The Mexica were one of the groups of the Aztecs, but you have all of these subcultures, sub identities that people can take on, right? And genetics uh, on the genetic level, like I said, there are what we have, the best that we have are comparisons and contrasts to other reference sequences that you have in a database, right? And and there is an objection that I often see in some of these groups where there are objections to ancestry DNA tests because they say that they are only linking you to modern reference populations, right? So, for example, they'll say that you link me to West Africa only based on the modern people of West Africa whom are there, or you link me to Native Americans based on the Native American populations whom are there today, whether that be in the
Correct.
US
Yes, I agree.
or in Mexico. That's certainly one objection. Uh, but there is another side to that coin where we also have DNA sequences of skeletons that are buried in the ground that have been there before Columbus. So you have reference sequences to individuals like Naya from Yucatan, or individuals like Ansek Child from Montana, or Kennewick Man from Washington. And these, yeah, right. I mean, they would match those whom we typically would call a modern day Native American. Yes, those would be the exact same people. Right. No, no, no,
I
no.
always say they never found Homo neanderthal bones or remnants in the Americas. Just want to note that. I don't think
Right.
there's ever
No,
been a Neanderthal bone found in the Americas.
oh, yes, absolutely. Because I didn't want to go on without introducing him. We actually missed him during the introduction. No, no, that's 100% fine. Mr. James Richardson, or I'm sorry, James Richard Williams. I'm sorry. How are you doing today, sir?
I am doing amazing. Sorry for the late entry. I was actually eating out with the family. So, my specialty is actually haploid groups in anthropology and paleogenetics. So, since all of us we were just touching on paleogenetics and anthropology of Native American populations, is I believe the proper terminology that we were using. So, essentially, what you don't want to do is you don't want to look at there's two different types of groups if you want to look at for purity in different populations, especially in anthropology, because modern day science, it's always just been, oh, well, let's use reference populations. I personally only use DNA that doesn't change. And there's, sorry, I have a slight touch of the cold, but there's two different types of genetic material that doesn't change. That's your mitochondrial genome, which is passed down from mother to child, and then you have your Y chromosome. You might be familiar with a lot of Y chromosome DNA studies that are coming out, which compare the SNPs, just SNPs in your genome, compares the Y chromosome just to see where you're closely related to. And all it is just a comparison and contrast. But since your Y chromosome doesn't recombinate with any of your other chromosomes, the DNA doesn't change. So you have Y chromosome haploid groups that are very precise in telling you where you're from. That you
Right.
Yes, that is correct. I was actually so when we say modern DNA doesn't evolve or doesn't change, actually the Y chromosome and the ncDNA actually do change over time. They form into different haploid groups, and that takes about a minimum of 1,000 years to form. So Native American populations, some of which have been here for about 10,000 years, and even if you look at the Aborigine people of Australia, they have a different haploid group that is very, very distinct. Their mitochondrial genome and haploid groups are actually more closely related to Denisovans and Neanderthales than modern day Homo sapiens, if you could call us that. Modern day Homo sapiens themselves aren't distinct species. There was Homo sapiens, and then there was Homo sapiens neanderthalis, and then there was Homo sapiens denisovians, and then modern day Homo sapiens are kind of a hybrid between all three. That's why we're Homo sapiens sapiens. We're a distinction of the three different subspecies.
Right, right, absolutely. Yeah, and needless to
Or
say,
I have to say, or could it be that those subgroups came from one? Because I'm two X chromosomes. So what I'm saying is, can those be the descendants and off branches of a Homo sapien, those other groups?
Well, being that they are subspecies, it does mean that they're descended. But since if you look at all modern day humans, that includes Native American, that includes African, if you want to call it African, that includes Asian, that even includes the Australian Aborigine people, which their genetics is like a time capsule. It is it is very untainted even after the British colonization of Australia. Their genetics is really shows, if you want to go by the land bridge or if you want to go by Polynesian colonization of the Americas, the Aborigine people, well, I'm not sure how familiar you are, but around 10,000 years ago, back when the Sahara was green, Australia was about 45% larger. It was called Oceania. Or there's a different name.
Yeah.
Mr. Spencer, you can help me out with that.
Sundaland.
Sundaland.
Yes. Those islands. Or those are
And
islands now.
yeah, they're islands now, but back then they were a large continent, comparable in size to what would be a good comparison? I guess they would
Present
be,
Indonesia. Or I'm sorry, Southeast Asia. That whole
yeah,
region.
Southeast Asia would be a good comparison in size.
But
And
you
so,
wouldn't say like a Mexico? The way Mexico is like kind of like this peninsula.
well, Mexico is only a peninsula from a meteor impact that occurred millions of years ago. So it doesn't really do it justice because half of the land that makes up the Mexican plate, the continental plate, is underwater due to a meteor impact that was about the size of, Mount Everest, causing the KT extinction, which wiped out most of life on Earth about 65 million years ago. But let's actually get back to genetics because I'm going off on a tangent. I'm famous for that. So basically, if you look at the Y chromosome, okay, so Y chromosome DNA, it does change, but it changes relatively slow to the rest of the genome, along with mitochondrial DNA. So with mitochondrial DNA, you can identify haploid groups, and since both of these DNAs are preserved relatively well in grave sites, so although I guess you could say human remains, I'm kind of fond of the term using corpse, but it doesn't really sound nice. So all these human remains scattered across the Americas that were pre-Columbus and pre-European contact. Even if you want to go all the way back to the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons when they first arrived on America 100 a year, what is it, 100 years, 172 years, something like that, before Columbus arrived in the
Yeah.
Americas, which they
Right.
brought over slaves, and it is even thought that they were to interbreed with the Native American populations at the time. So that could even be more genetic drift from European populations intermingling, and then that could even fuck up the Y chromosome because all it needs to do is have a son, have a son, have a son. So mitochondrial DNA is the only real thing that you can look at if you want to go for towards eastern seaboard. But if you start to go towards the western coast, then you can use both mitochondrial and Y DNA. Okay, so from my understanding, I have a friend that goes more in depth into actually Native American populations. I'm only here because paleogenetics is my specialty, but I have a friend, and through genetic studies, who's actually deemed that the OLMEC are very close, not only phylogenetically, but mitochondrially and Y chromosome from the males that were tested of the corpses that were actually found, or human remains, depending on what you want to call it. They're actually very closely related to the uncontacted tribes located in some parts of Brazil, Peru, and so I guess if you want to use them as a comparison for not only phenotypical structures, but only also genotypical structures, you could see that the phenotypes would be very similar. So I guess facial structures and how they do not have a pronounced brow ridge, which a lot of people, when they talk about bringing an influx of European traits, Europeans as a whole have a increased brow ridge, a large brow ridge, also comparable to the African American population. But this trait is thought to be brought over from interbreeding and intermingling with Homo sapiens neanderthalis, which is not. Okay, so when you talk about Native American colonization of the original people and the Aborigine people, all of these people came across. There's two different colonization events. I'm pretty sure, since you are Native American yourself, I am not. I'm a mix between as I'm a mix of, what is it, Northern Nigerian, sorry, and a couple different clans in Northern Scotland. I'm a Armstrong clan, as well as, she did mention the Tuaregs earlier. I'm about 7% Tuareg. So that's just an interesting fun fact about myself. But I did not.
Cool.
Yeah. So essentially, when the original colonization came from, it came from two different places. It came from Russia, before Russia was even Russia. It was the Asian people of Russia, and then they were breeding on top of. I really sound like I'm animalizing people right now. This is terrible. They were
I mean,
making,
but we're the animal kingdom, right? Are we
yeah,
not? What do
Yeah,
we say that?
ultimately.
they were making sweet love on a land bridge that connected. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm personally fond of
Let's get
Billie
it
Ocean,
on.
like Caribbean Queen. But so essentially, oh. So essentially, there was a colonization event that came across on the land bridge that connects the northern part of Russia to our northern part of Alaska. Actually, there's still little islands in between, and if you stand on the northernmost part of Russia on the coastline, you can actually see the largest city in Alaska. The lights from it, you can't like discernibly make out buildings.
That's why I thought Sarah Palin was not that, comical, because when you go to like the Northern Ocean, you really can see like across different nations. So you really can. It's just like
But so we had that colonization event from from Asian people coming from the Russian side. I actually believe you're correct with that being the Clovis people. I could be mistaken. I'm actually
Yeah,
more
it
fond
It's
of
shows.
the.
both. It's actually
It
both.
Yeah,
It's
both.
both.
It's
There was
both.
the Clovis people are the ones who they deem up to 13.5 thousand years ago, who would have been crossing the Bering Strait
Mhm.
through the land bridge. And prior to that, they're calling pre-Clovis any site that's slightly before that time period, say 15,000 years ago. You find a 14,000-year-old site in Chile. So we know that there must have been humans coming across before 14,000 years ago to eventually come, to Chile, to get to Chile at 14,000. So the pre-Clovis are hypothesized to have been crossing through the western the western seashore through the Kelp Highway, which are these little islands surrounding the land bridge, and they effectively cross through there as well as the land bridge not too long after. So
So
Correct.
actually, correct. Yeah. And there's a couple different ways to say this. When American people, well, Native American people, when the colonization events happened, you guys talked about pre-Clovis, and that would actually be Polynesian people as a whole, because when they were colonizing, Polynesian people were originally the descendants of Denisovans and early Homo sapiens. Neanderthals weren't in Asia, by the way. Denisovans broke off early off the Homo sapien branch, moved into Asia, and actually are thought to be one of the ancestors to the pygmy human, also known as the Homo hobbit, which is Homo habilis, found on wait, no, it's Homo florensis.
fluorescences.
Yeah,
but
and
sometimes
so
I've heard where the pygmies were from certain parts of Africa too.
the pygmy is a very common term. All it
The
just
Yeah.
different
means,
pygmy.
yeah. There's
Right.
multiple
Yeah.
different types of pygmy. This is the type of pygmy that arrived was created through island dwarfism. I'm sorry, I'm slurring my words. It's like I'm drunk. I swear I'm not.
So these are
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like these are just your
In the region.
tropical. Are they just like? Is it because of the area, like the terrain? Like what makes them like dwarfism? But they're still like in
Okay.
multiple places around the world?
Okay, so there's multiple different reasons. One of it could just be by luck. There could be genetic mutation. Another could be the population is genetically so small that mutations like this creep up, and then not to say weaker because that sounds like eugenics, but different mutations that are disadvantaged die out, and size isn't really advantageous or disadvantageous unless you get taller, because once you get taller, height starts to become an issue because that means more food. So when you start to get smaller, it also means less resources, which goes along with island gigantism and dwarfism. Island dwarfism is what we're talking about with Homo florensis. And basically, there's not enough resources on the island to support a large population. So the
Right.
population
So it could be the diet.
yeah, it could be diet, it could be what they're intaking, it could be the size of the island itself. Altitude towards the ocean actually would have a bigger role in making them taller, because the closer you are to sea level, the more oxygen you're obtaining in your lungs. So you look at the people from the Tibetan monks and people that actually live in Tibet that have the mutation in their hemoglobin, so they produce twice as much hemoglobin as normal in their red blood cells. They're actually smaller than normal because they're not receiving enough oxygen.
Wow, that just reminds me of yoga. Like that's they're so focused on breathing.
That's that pranayama.
Well, but then really yoga is a lot of breathing, so that that kind of makes sense too, because for those people that aren't more into meditation, that becomes a lot of the, I guess, religion and spirituality. They're adapting over time, and I would just say maybe that would play a part in it too. Just genre, everyday lifestyle, and what they do in terms of like spiritual practices.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah. So as we can see, the environment plays a huge role, right, in morphology, as well as random mutation that occurs within our DNA as we live, and then once we have offspring, there's variation in the offspring there, and then traits get selected for by the environment, right? Which is why you have different humans who look differently today, and in addition of course, back then we were not alone. We also had other species of hominins walking amongst us. So that also influenced our phenotypes to a certain degree. We know that the red hair and the freckles in northwestern Europe are traits from the Neanderthal, as well as there's this little bone that sticks out in the back of the head of some Europeans that also was an influence from the Neanderthal that was there. There's some assumptions that are made by some people who are just not literate in science, who just assume that, well, some of the Caucasians, some of the Europeans, or rather all Europeans are just light skinned because they also inherit that from the Neanderthal. But you have to remember, there were cousins of the Neanderthal who were in Central Asia and in Southern Asia, and were at were traits as predictable, were they linear and as simple as that, you would expect South Asians to be just as light skinned as the Northern Europeans, but they are not. We obviously see that some traits stick, some don't, depending on the environment. You're closer to the equator, you're going to continuously receive more sunlight, and your body has to maintain the melanin in order to protect itself from the sunlight. But if you're in the northern hemisphere, it's not going to benefit you to have so much melanin, because therefore your dietary needs need to keep up with that melanin. And otherwise, you get rickets. From Well, if I might just say, and then I'll leave the ground to Mr. Armstrong. Um, so as far as what we can tell from the studies that I've come across, they certainly, like all humans on Earth, are going to share some uh, genetic homology, genetic similarity with Africans and with anybody else in the world, because at some point we all descend from a common ancestor, right? And it's actually found that the melanin, the gene that's responsible for maintaining their melanin, is actually very similar um, to the Africans as well. However, that may be as far as it goes. There's a lot of other genes, and particularly when we're talking about haplogroups, the Y chromosome or the mtDNA as well, that has more similarity with other Asians than it does with Africans. So I would say it's relative. There's certainly molecular clocks that are used in genetics, where they can trace back how far back does this particular sequence goes back to, how far back does this one go back to, and there's ways to uh, you know um, label things, or consider things on that basis. But overall, um, I would say that most scientists would say most of the similarity, genetically at least, would be with the rest of their Asian kin.
I do have a couple opinions. So first of all, in the Polynesian colonization, actually, the first hominids, not even including the genus Homo, the first hominids out of Africa weren't even Homo sapiens. Actually, the Australopithecines, Australopithecus africanus, was the first hominid to ever make it out of Africa. Their skulls and a lot of teeth and a lot of dental work have been found all the way down until different Indonesian islands. And they're even rumored to be in Australia, but I highly doubt it, even though that at the time they were connected, but there was a bunch of different land barriers, if that makes sense. There was a lot of different mountain ranges that are now small archipelagos, but at the time they were large mountains. It would be like how would I put this? It's like crossing the Swiss Alps in nothing but Crocs and a loincloth. So yeah, and so essentially the Aborigine people, in my personal opinion, along with couple different papers that back this up, when the Denisovans were making it down, when they were making it over, there was a bunch of different hominid species. And since the Australopithecines, even though they were in a different genus, they were still relatively close to early hominids. And it's even theorized that Australopithecines were able to interbreed with early stem Homo species. Not to say that we would be able to breed with like an Australopithecus africanus now, we're too heavily derived, but there is a theory that in the way that the Denisovans and modern Polynesian people, when they were making their way down to Australia through colonization, that they were interbreeding with some of the other hominid species in the area. And since a lot of these, you could say, were more archaic, not to say that they're primitive because that's racist, but they were more archaic in early hominid features, that they would pick up more African like traits, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that I mean that's just what we're discovering now, because at this point when you go to Tulum, Mexico, and you see the pyramids, or you go inside and you look at the artwork, and we're still getting information, because they still say things like only 5% of the Mayan temples and pyramids have been uncovered. So it just lets us like leads me to believe or wonder how much is out there that we still just haven't, excavated at this point. So I mean, it's still, for me, it seems like this story is still being unlocked, and it's a lot that's still being uncovered. But when you talk about, also there's pyramids in Missouri and Illinois, and there's pyramids and mounds, royal mounds in Georgia. It just makes me think, again, there's still so much in the United States or the area of North America that we just don't really talk about, or hasn't been uncovered like we have in parts of Egypt, or the Sudanese, like the land of Nubia and places like that. So, you think back, they can talk about the past 100 years of excavations and, what some people call tomb raiders and all those things, but we're still, like, in the Americas, it's only so many hundreds of years. And so, I think we forget, like, if they say that these pyramids are 9,000 years old, and or there's places in Missouri where they have done some excavation, but then they stop and they find artifacts of the Jaguar Mayan in Missouri that's 12,000 years old, like anything from a grass shoe, or the money with, or what they could determine was money, or some type of like panel disc, which shows the Quetzalcoatl or Jaguar deity or king ruler. But they're finding these artifacts in Missouri, which were commonly known to be in Mexico. So, it's still a lot. And then these projects, I don't know if they're just not well funded, or people are just not interested in them. That's what I was saying. It's like, I see 8 deer jaguar claw. I see what Quetzalcoatl looks like in terms of some of this artwork. And I don't think that just the average eye will look at some of these artifacts and say, oh, I understand what it is, because we weren't really taught that in school. And it's not really something that's talked about in college. So, the art interpretation is still, I guess, under review. But I do also understand, like, a few months ago, they just determined that a lot of the Mayan the codices and indexes were authentic. And it's like, okay, great. I don't think we had a problem, but there were some people that were skeptical. So once they prove that those are authentic, then we can go back into those codes. Now we can start deciphering. But there's still a lot of skepticism, it seems, when it comes to the true ancestry of the Mayan, the Olmec. Well, I think that's kind of like the proto civilization. But then, what did they call themselves that? It's just like, I understand this area is Maya, but yes.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah. From thanks. There's a lot of misconceptions with with artifacts in the areas of the mounds. That there's a lot of talk of Mayan influence and stuff like that, and there's no direct evidence of direct influence of Mayans being in the Midwest. We do know that through years and years and years of living on this continent, people moved around and roamed around, exchanged ideas, exchanged languages, exchanged uh, um, customs and things like that. So you're going to find some similarities. For example, the Pueblo people have a snake, a so-called deity associated with agriculture. If you talk to the Pueblo people in New Mexico, their water serpent is attached to their agricultural ceremonies and things of that nature. Well, if you just go down a little bit south to Mexico, Quetzalcoatl, or the snake deity, is attached to corn. Well, corn is agriculture. So there's relationships that go across the Americas. That doesn't mean that that there was direct contact between the people. It just means that there's a fluid uh, continuity between cultures that share. But it doesn't mean like a group of Mayans went and then uh, somehow overnight landed in the Midwest, and those artifacts now that may resemble Mayan artifacts means that it came from them. It's just not that. It's just not that simple. Um, we, yeah. Yes. Right. 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 Yes. Right. 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 Sure. Sure. Yeah. I've read those articles. I've seen those things being spread through social media, and it's just 100% nonsense. It's um, it's it's racism, because basically what it's saying, some of these articles that I read that are being pushed by publications like Atlanta Black Star. You got pseudo scholars that have no background in Mesoamerican studies.
I find Atlanta Black Star to be extremely credible.
Well, they're not.
Um,
Okay, so
yeah, that's where we're
they're
gonna have
not
a
credible. They're not.
problem
They're not credible at
because
all.
they are credible.
No,
Because
they're not.
I know the people there, and
Well,
that's
that's
what
okay.
your people have been doing that and debunking
You
us
okay? You
for
can know them.
centuries.
Okay, are you? I was speaking. So Lila, Lila. So I was speaking.
Yeah, they've been saying they're experts on my people, but we're the oldest civilization on the planet.
Who? Well, see, you're. So here's the thing.
I'm
Here,
Mesoamerican.
here, here's the
Right.
thing. Well, well, I'll go back.
So
Like I
don't
said,
let's not diss Atlanta Black Star because they're not here
well,
to defend
well, you
themselves.
don't have to take it personal. You could like,
But I will because I know the publisher.
well, because
Great.
just because you know the person, Lila, doesn't mean anything, Lila. You're making an association fallacy, and I can prove to you that hold on.
See, this is where it becomes racist, and that's why they continue to push
No,
that
it's
slave
racist.
narrative.
It's racist. It's racist. Okay. Okay. So these articles claim that Africans came to the Americas and civilized the Americas. That is racist. Okay, that is racist. Because what it's saying is that Native Americans were not qualified within our own abilities to civilize ourselves. That is that parallels what. Right, right, and no, no, there's no Africans on any Mayan walls. If you want to look at the
No, I
artwork,
don't
it's like,
call them Africans. That's a colonizer term. No,
well,
they're not. They're melanated for sure.
okay, melanated melanated is meaningless. My ex-wife is melanated. She's Mayan from Guatemala. She's very dark. But she's not uh, a black person. She's not these people that are in social media saying that there's black aboriginals and they're the real. So
Well,
melanated
what
doesn't
color
mean
are the
anything.
Aboriginal?
It doesn't matter what color they are. It's about who
But
they are
color matters
genetically.
to me. Color matter. No,
No,
melanin matters to
color
me.
is not is irrelevant, Lila.
Well, we say melanin deficiency. Yes. Melanin deficiency. Correct.
Everybody, but for scientifically, hold on. Scientifically, everybody has melanin, so there's no such thing as melanin deficient.
Melanin deficiency. Yes, they have the melanin
No,
deficiency.
the only people that are melanin deficient are albinos. Okay, so
And that's what they are to me.
no, they're not albinos. So
They're albino,
no,
red
they are not.
hair,
They
white
are not
skin.
albinos. Yeah. Okay. So going back, right. So if you if you went down to the Mayan, whether it be Tikal, Chichen Itza, Palenque, they've excavated these places thoroughly, and all the remains, the genetic makeup of these people, they match the modern population that's there. So skin color is irrelevant. They match the people that are there. They are not phenotypically, genetically, linguistically anything other than Mayan. So there's no mystery, as Lila was alluding to, of some mystery because we haven't excavated enough sites. That is not true. The glyphs on the Mayan ruins.
But why excavate at all?
I'm speaking, Lila, please. I didn't interrupt you once, so I would appreciate if you would do that, not interrupt me while I'm making. Okay, so the glyphs have all been decoded. The language in the glyphs is used by the modern Mayan. The code would never have been decoded if it wasn't for modern Mayan linguistics. They helped the archaeologists break the code. And the names of the people that are carved in the walls and are painted in the walls, they know their names of their other ancestors. One of the largest sites is in Palenque. He's a Lord Pakal. His ancestors still live around there. Excuse me, his descendants still live in the area. They know this genetically. So all we have to do is look at, it's called Occam's razor. If you apply Occam's razor to find who were the Maya, just look. There's no need to look 4,000 miles across the ocean to say, well, because the image on the mural is a dark skinned person, we have to look to Africa. That is idiotic.
Absolutely. And so when you talk about decoding, again, just November of 2019, they finally authenticated and said yes. For all that skepticism, is that yes, they are authentic. So if you continue to read a lot of those codes, they will tell you that they were autochthonous to the land. They will say that we come from this. So I agree, they were not African. And that's something that you go to Australia and say African. You go to the Ottoman Islands, you say African. And those people never called themselves African.
Well, but we know what they're referring to when they say that.
Yeah, but that's a whole. But for me, that gets into a lot of Nazism. That tells me I'm not Native American. I'm African, and that's where a lot of the misidentification comes from, and the disenfranchisement.
Going back to the article that you were defending, there's articles in Black Atlanta Star that say that they use their sources, which is like David Imhotep, which claims that the Maya are Africans.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of this research will continue to happen. But and when we get more people with melanin in their skin down there, and again, kinky, coily hair, and full features in their face,
what is melanin
when they start to do more research, it's okay. It's okay for them to say that, and then they will come to understand.
It's not okay to say. It's not okay. It's not okay to say the Maya are African. It's not okay to say that.
Well, that's where their particular research has led them to believe in certain commonality. But you forget latitude and longitude lines. Let's think about latitudinal lines. Yeah. It's just like the Doggin tribe as well. I mean, a lot of people debunked what they were saying about Sirius until how did they do this? They didn't have telescopes. Well, these are people that are naturally spiritual, a whole other set. Okay, they're just different, and they don't have to really explain anything to anyone. They're indigenous, and remember, you're a newcomer to their land, and you're asking them questions, and then you're skeptical at the same time. So what we're saying is they can go and say that, but at the same time, I think if they were to continue to flourish and do further research, and again, I always invite people, come on down to Mexico, come to Central America. I've been to Brazil. I've seen what the people look like, and it ain't what they're showing me in propaganda and television. I work in news media, so I see on the ground what's happening.
Awesome.
Then I also see what's put into the advertisement and what is put into the movies. So I'm seeing a huge disconnect there as well in terms of, and it's not, and that's just how they want to market it, and that's just how they want to, and they want to show only one groups of people. I think these people lived well together. I think they did a lot of things together. And then when there's foreigners that come to the island, it's I'm going to fund this side and I'm going to fund this, because we know that they're warring tribes. Just because they were living together didn't mean they lived well together. There were still wars.
What does that have to do with anything, though? I'm confused.
Well, if you don't understand war and colonialism, then you got a lot to learn.
No, I don't understand what that has to do.
I'm talking about wars.
I don't have to.
Colonizers came over and funded certain groups against others.
But what does that have to do with David?
That friendship treaty is why some groups are accepted and some groups are disenfranchised.
Can I finish? What does that have to do with David Imhotep lying and saying that the original Maya
bring him on the program. I said I knew the publisher. If you want to bring on David, do that as well.
Well, my point is, if you let me finish and stop interrupting me, is that Atlanta Black Star used him as a source, so therefore Atlanta Black Star is not credible.
They have thousands of articles.
And it's not.
They have
a lot
of articles. You're pinpointing one, and that's fine. He has a right to share his research and findings, just like your flat earthers did.
He's a right.
Your flat earthers are highly published too.
And it's pseudo. It's bullshit, and I have the right to call it bullshit.
So now we're cussing.
Oh, so yeah, no, I'm cussing because you are.
She left.